open the floor. All right, welcome everyone. We're really happy to have Professor Rens Bod from the University of Amsterdam talk about a few things, but most importantly, this very important book, 40 stellen in de wetenschap, about over de wetenschap. It's not really showing with my Zoom background, but you can see it here. So, which is a little book full of wisdom about the current state of universities and academia. And this webinar is a co-production of the Scientists for Future Scientist series, where we will also post this recording, and also the Scientist Rebellion Reclaim the University study group. And the timing is perfect. It's the 12th of November, and we're 2 days away from a big protest organized by WO in Actie, which Rens is one of the founders, to protest planned budget cuts to Dutch academia. So Rens, the floor is yours. Thanks very much for sharing your insights with us, and we look forward to learning from you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me and for having me. So while I'll focus on speaking not too long, maybe 20 minutes, so that there will be ample time for discussion, if that's okay to you. So I was asked to introduce basically this little booklet. Here it is indeed also, 40 theses about academia, as you might translate it. It's sadly only in Dutch, but if you use, Google Translate or any other less commercial translating tool, you can easily convert it into English, I hope. Any other language as well, by the way. So I will also talk about its follow-up, because the booklet may be well known and it's already written 4 years ago, but I think it's still quite topical. So first, let me say a little bit about who am I. Maybe many of you know me, but very briefly, I'm a professor here at the University of Amsterdam in computational humanities. You might wonder what that is, but that's for another time I can talk about. And I'm also one of the co-founders of WO in Actie, already a long time ago by now. And we were striving not only for adequate funding, but also, most importantly, perhaps, for a more democratic university. But funny enough, it's turned out that striving for adequate funding 8 years ago, or 7 years ago perhaps, was much easier than striving for a democratic university, although that costs much less money, the latter thing. But you can see how tough and how terribly unflexible university structures actually are. So what we did during the last 7 years, basically, we organized, especially during the first 4 years of our existence, until we got this amazing amount of money from the Ministry of Education. We organized demonstrations, I mean by that, many open air lectures with all of you, with many people actually. It's not just us of WO in Actie, but many people contributed to it. Maybe some of you remember this. We organized so-called white strikes, where people only work exactly the number of hours that they are paid for. Debates, petitions, lots of op-eds, and other things since 2017. We also wrote a little booklet that I just mentioned, 40 Theses on Academia. And one of the things, I think one of the major things we achieved during the first 2 years of our existence is that we managed to convince the Parliament. And next, the Parliament convinced of course, gave the job to the Ministry of Education to instigate an independent report by so-called PricewaterhouseCoopers, who had as a task to figure out whether and how much the universities, by the way, also the high schools, the polytechnics in the Netherlands were underfinanced, or underfunded, if at all. And that report, which took several months and many thousands of euros to be finished, concluded that the universities in the Netherlands were underfunded by almost 1.3 billion euros a year, so structurally. And actually, during the last government, this report was taken very seriously by the four parties, especially by the then party D66, who took it as a major reason for giving a lot of funding, so that a lot of extra funding, as you may know, so that this underfunded situation could be solved. This was actually in 2022. Now, why protest again right now? This is an open door. I don't have to speak to the converted, I guess, but just to bring in memory for those who are not directly involved in WO in Actie, right now it has turned out that the current very right or radical right-wing government has imposed probably the worst budget cuts ever. Some people say the worst budget cut since 1945. Maybe that's correct. So it's not ever, but for at least almost 100 years by now.
Rens, can I interrupt you for a second?
Sure.
The slides are not progressing for us. Is it correct that you're still on the first slide?
No.
It's
No.
also perfectly intelligible what you're saying, but
Yeah, no. But I want to show you the slide. So this happens
okay.
more often. So how is this
Yeah,
possible?
it's okay. I mean, I think we could follow, but just so you know, so you might have
No,
to.
but that's a pity. Let me
Yeah.
figure out
Thank
what's
you
happening.
for bringing this up in the
Sure.
chat.
So let's stop sharing and let's try it again. But thank you for go ahead to share screen. Yeah. So where is my entire screen window? Let's try it again.
Let's, yeah.
Then I have indeed. Thank you. So let's continue. After, as I said, we are going to protest right now again, simply because there is another budget cut of almost 1.5 billion euro per year now. So that's even worse than was announced, let's say, up to a month ago. Then it was about 1.3, but now it has arrived with an extra cut on NWO. As an institution, it has arrived up to 1.5 billion per year. So I gave a list here of the many things that are going to be cut. I'm not going through all of them, but this is one of the reasons that we are going to protest again right now. Perhaps it might be useful to stress, and this is given here in red in the current slide, that WO in Actie, together with all the other partners in our coalition, and we're talking then about the student unions, we're talking about the several organizations of the postdocs in the Netherlands, postdoc.nl, the Promovendi, so-called PhD students in the Netherlands, PPN. Altogether, we have demanded that the budget cuts be withdrawn. Now, I remember that seems to be very unlikely that this will happen. But on the other hand, don't forget that the current government has no majority in the first chamber, in the so-called Senate. And they can still block the cuts. And that's why it's actually so important that we believe that we should let our voice hear this current Thursday, and showing that we can come up with thousands of people. We expect at least 5,000, maybe at least 6,000 people. We hope even to get more people there, both students and scholars and scientists. So this is actually what we're going to do on the 14th of November at 1 p.m. We'll be there in Utrecht, starting at the Moreelse Park. And if the government still continues with their budget cuts, and in case these budget cuts are also going to be accepted by the two chambers of the parliament, we are planning, together with unions again, and also together with all these groups that you mentioned here, to go towards a disruptive strike. This will basically be preceded by initial short strikes, the so-called walkouts, short strikes, where we go out of the lectures with or without the students, but we go out to the streets, moving to, for example, the academic building or the government building of the university. But it will also involve a more, let's say, disruptive and longer strike. One of the strikes that, for me, was actually, just to give you an idea, very illuminating, and I've repeated this already a couple of times during my last public talks for example, at the alternative opening of the academic year, was an announced strike at the University of St Andrews about 14 years ago in Scotland, where at the beginning of the academic year, people announced that they would strike exactly at the very end of the academic year, with the terrible consequence, I agree, that students could not graduate or could not even go to the next year. And it took a long time, just about a week before this announced strike, which seemed terribly, disruptive, that the Scottish government actually accepted the demands of the Scottish universities that time, around 2010. So sometimes these announcements of very disruptive strikes do help, at least in Scotland. This is no guarantee for the current government, but let's hope that this is not necessary. But money, and this is very important, so we've so far only mentioned this problem of being underfinanced as universities, which is already dramatic enough, but money is not the only problem. In fact, since 1996, by now almost 30 years ago, the Dutch universities follow a very neoliberal new public management structure, which is known as the MUB, the MUP, as they call it in Dutch, the MUP. the modernisering universitair bestuur, the modernization of university government. This was actually one of the reasons that we also wrote this booklet. Money is one of the problems, but perhaps not even the most important one in current universities. Well, the budget cuts are extremely detrimental right now, but there are other things that may be even more important. To give you an idea of this MUP, it meant that the so-called downward accountability that existed in the previous law until 1996, which was called the WUB, the Wet Universitair Bestuur, was turned into a fully upward accountability. I hope people can still hear me. Yep. Universities are actually treated as commercial companies in this sense. They are basically, directly governed by a board that is not even elected by the own academic community. So, indeed, democratic structures such as the notion of the Senate have been abolished. It's true that for example, the University of Amsterdam, where I am part of, still has a Senate. I mean, they call it a Senate, but nobody knows where this Senate is. People are not elected for that. They only are allowed to give some advice. It's not to be mistaken by the so-called medezeggenschapsraad, the council. That's another thing. So this is actually one of the reasons that we wrote this book together with Remco Breuker and Ingrid Robeyns. The plan was to start to give you today a kind of introduction to this booklet and to show that although it was written 4 years ago, most of the theses I think are still very relevant, even for today's situation, perhaps even more relevant than ever. So the first thesis of this book, I'm not going through all the book, I will just give you an overview of about 5 or 6 of these theses that I think are most interesting for.
I think we've lost Rens there.
Yeah, I don't hear him.
Can you pause again the recording?
Thanks, yeah. So what I was just saying, repeating the last sentence, is that we started our booklet with a kind of concept what a university as a universitas, as it's called in Latin, a kind of community, should look like. And this is not necessarily prescriptive, it was also descriptive in the sense that we created this definition of a university, basing it on the development of the earliest medieval universities till the current day. So we say in our first thesis that the university is a community whose mission is to provide, and I quote here indeed, independent research, independent education, and some kind of community service based on independent scientific and scholarly understanding, something that is nowadays called outreach. This is actually the goal of the universities, that they were doing independent and that they were, let's say, independent and autonomous institutions already from its earliest European inceptions in the 11th century in Bologna and Salerno. And then after that, it was further, let's say, developed in Paris. And of course, it has a long history, the history of universities. But basically, this idea of university with that has this academic freedom, independent of the control of the state or even the church, although this was sometimes more wishful thinking than reality in the past. But this is still the goal of this notion of university. I quickly move to this second thesis, which goes into more of the depth of what kind of knowledge the university produces. And I think this is still relevant, even especially for today, when the universities are so much under attack. Namely, that the university's mission involves 3 types of knowledge that also can be distinguished quite carefully. First of all, we have this so-called fundamental, often called also curiosity-driven research, where people really try to figure out just things that they like to figure out, and this has also been shown in the history of knowledge and the history of science and scholarship to be of extremely important relevance, simply because sometimes entirely curiosity-driven research brings you much further than only doing applied research. But the second kind of knowledge is indeed applied research, applying ideas that already exist in research to very concrete situations, which is also quite a challenge. It's not easy to do that. And the third notion, and this cannot be stressed strongly enough, and this is often forgotten, by the way, even by our current ministers of education and research, is that universities also do critical research. They produce critical knowledge. This already happened in the 13th and especially in the 14th century when there was theological criticism. And also a lot of philosophical criticism, of course. But it continues up to the current day where people do critical research on, for example, thinking about what are the consequences of inequality in a country like the Netherlands, or what is happening with nitrogen pollution, the nitrogen problem. And what we claim in this second thesis and what we try to develop in our book is that a healthy democracy, or you could also say an adult democracy or whatever that means, but just call it a democracy, needs actually to protect all three of these types of knowledge. And indeed, I already mentioned that this also the notion of critical research that is often forgotten has a very old tradition. And what we especially see not only today in the Netherlands is that radical right-wing governments have an extremely problematic relationship, especially with the notion of critical research, but also with universities in general. We can see that in Italy under Giorgia Meloni, who attacks, let's say, academics for several reasons. We've seen it even stronger, much stronger in Hungary. We have seen it in Poland, in Slovakia, and we right now see it again in the Netherlands, where lots of research is sometimes put away as woke, even, as, let's say, not even searching for the truth, but just to doing leftish hobbies, as it's called. So this is a thesis that we might come back to. I will discuss a few other theses because for the reason of time, we missed some important minutes. I'll just mention a couple of other theses that might be fascinating to discuss later on. One of the theses that are very dear to us is that teaching at universities cannot exist without research. This is, of course, based on a very famous notion of Wilhelm von Humboldt, the great 19th century German humanist, who phrased it as Einheit, Lehre und Forschung, the unity of teaching and research. But the idea is, of course, that the teaching of students should be research informed. Now, this is not an idea that stems from the early 19th century. You also found it with the formation of, for example, Leiden University in the late 16th century. Every professor should not only do teaching, but also do independent research, him or herself. Basically, it was almost himself up to the first professors at the University of Bologna that were female around 1750, like Laura Bassi and Maria Gaetano. But that was only 150 years later. So indeed, all people were assumed to do both research and teaching, so that every student would be research informed. Now, sadly enough, this is not at all anymore the current case, especially at faculties of social science and humanities, but also faculties of master and business administration, often have more than 50% and some even 60% of purely lecturing positions without any research time. And also at the University of Amsterdam, this was until 2 years ago, 38%. I've heard that this has decreased a little bit, but it's still higher than 28%. So it's still far too high. We believe everybody who has a position at the university should have both teaching and research. At least that's the goal of the university as a institution. Okay, well, one of the other things that came out of the reports during the last few years is that the teaching of students in most universities, in most departments, so there are always exceptions, I fully agree with that, but in most departments, it's currently impossible to do teaching, let alone research, without structural overwork. Now you could say, right, wait a minute, all over the world, all over the jobs, even in the Netherlands, people do overwork, perhaps even structural overwork. But it depends also how much it is. It turns out that according to the FNV, the Dutch union, and AOB, another Dutch union, although they are now connected, teaching actually involves even 25 up to 40% overtime, which is so much that even if you are, let's say, assigned or have a position as a university lecturer, an assistant professor in UD, you basically don't have any research time anymore. So it was actually what one of the, I think it was Sigrid Kaag who said a couple of years ago, before this big investment, she said scientists and scholars are basically people who do teaching during the day, they do research in the evening, and they write their projects in the weekend. That was actually the situation, indeed. But there's another thing, and now I move already to thesis 17, for the sake of time, that the extreme hierarchy at the universities in the Netherlands, it's not the case everywhere in the world, but basically there's a recurring pattern here. This extreme hierarchy makes academics feel unsafe, which is another major problem of universities, the safety or the social safety problem. So in our booklet, in our little book, we make a case for, first of all, getting jus promovendi, so the right to doctorate, or the right to promote students to the title of doctor, that has to be open to all academic staff. For many people, this is an open door, even, because in the UK, if you are a lecturer, senior lecturer, or professor, you always have this jus promovendi. Same counts in France. If you're a maître de conférence, or if you're a full professeur de l'université, you get always this promotion rights. And even in Germany, people think that Germany is even more hierarchical than the Netherlands, but actually Germany is quite flat. As far as I know, as soon as you've obtained your habilitation, you have the right to promote students to the title of doctor. But maybe I'm wrong here. So that's one thing to reduce this terrible hierarchy at universities. But also the democratic elections of deans and rectors, which happens in most of the countries around us, is also something that is missing in the Netherlands. And we find it so straightforward that this should happen, that we could choose our own rector, for example. And it works perfectly well in other countries, and why can't the Netherlands do that? But every time we propose this, either to the minister or to our own CVB, to our own governing board, they turn their head almost away. They can't hear this discussion about democracy, which I find terribly, terribly annoying and also very sad, so to say. Well, there is some kind of democracy, people say. We have the Participation Council, the medezeggenschapsraad. But yeah, in practice, we know that they have very little power. And actually, often they only have advisory power, not really decision power. They should actually have the fundamental decision power to send even away governing boards, we believe. So that's a whole other issue that we develop in our little book. There are even 40 theses. I realize that. I can't go through all of them. But we strongly believe, and this is thesis 19, that as a consequence of our goal to get more democracy, we believe that this academic senate should return, but should also be more inclusive than before. Really, all staff should be represented in there, perhaps even students. But of course, we have to be careful that there is a good check and balances. We don't want to go into a situation where nothing can be decided anymore. But if we look around, Belgium is an interesting situation. It is a country where these things function quite well. So it is possible to do that. Okay, this is already something I've said before. I won't go into that for the sake of time. The university must be governed by academics. That seems rather a no-brainer, I would say. Oh, one thing that we also discuss quite in detail in our book is the problem of hyper-competition that has really gone out of hand in many countries. In the Netherlands, it has also become really detrimental for many young early career scholars and scientists. For example, we know that competition can be quite beneficial, but it is like an inverse U-curve. Some competition, for example, if around 30% of the project proposals get accepted, is very fertile. There's at least some competition, but hyper-competition, especially when it gets less than 10% of the proposals that get accepted, is detrimental. This is a social study that has been replicated several times. So we believe that too much competition, which is currently the case, is really harmful for the quality of research. And actually, interestingly, this thesis was taken very literally by the former Minister of Education and Research, Robert Dijkgraaf, who introduced basically these starters grants and stimulation grants. And this is exactly these startersbeurzen is exactly one of the things that will be gone entirely away from the 1st of January 2025 onwards. So we'll have no way that these young scholars that start as an assistant professor get some starting money, just a little bit of starting money. It's not that little, 300,000 euro it was, to get their research started, so that they don't have to immediately turn into this heavy hyper competition at NWO. Okay. Okay, I also believe that academics, not only me, but many of us believe that academics are also complicit in the current malaise. We have been too passive. We have been really too passive for too long. But since 2017, we hope that we have created a community that is really striving for not only for, let's say, appropriate funding, but also for a more democratic and also safer university. So I come to an end already. Not already, because time is flying. We believe that another university is possible and necessary. So, and this is actually the final thesis of our book. It's not only possible, but it's really necessary, because it will be important for both science and society alike. They will both benefit from it. I agree that we have to be massively willing to show and also explain the surplus of universities. We have to continuously explain to the society at large, and which we will also do in our talks this Thursday, why science and scholarship are so important, what we contribute to society. And we also believe that this can only be done with everybody's help, with your help. We have to turn up massively to show actually the importance of let's say, academia to society. Now, if you want to join, I don't know if everybody knows our links, I guess so, but this little booklet, 40 stellingen over de wetenschap, is free. You can, if you just search on the title, you find it. You don't have to copy the whole link here. You can also subscribe to our WO in Actie list, email list, and please do come to the demonstration this current Thursday in Utrecht at 1 p.m. We start in the Moreelse Park. There will be a lot of music also. There will be drummers, there will be music in head, there will be songs. So people have been very creative. It will also be a lot of fun, I'm sure. So I hope to see you then this coming Thursday. Thank you very much. I look forward also to hearing your suggestions. Okay, let's go. Thanks a lot. How can I go back to my... Can you see me again? Yeah, I can see you.
Yes, thank you very much. Perhaps you could unshare your screen again so that we can see, if you want. If you don't need it anymore.
Yes.
So feel free to turn on your video if you want to ask a question in person, or type it in the chat. Thank you, Rens. I'm happy to maybe start with an opening question, which relates a bit to these three distinctions of three types of research that you distinguish. I find very helpful. But I also see the strong narrative in the current media, and I think academians have also internalized this a bit, that we defend our research because of its applied nature. And perhaps you have also observed this. I've seen also in responses to the planned budget cuts that there were strong reactions from the universities to immediately explain why the curiosity-driven research that we do is actually also quite applicable. And I struggle with the best way to talk about these things. Where do you think is the balance, or how should we think about this tension between, on the one hand, defending curiosity-driven research for its own sake, and then also showing the potential applied nature of it down the line?
Yeah, very nice question indeed. We also have been struggling a lot with that, of course, as you can imagine. We believe that for pragmatic reasons, it can be useful to talk slightly more about applied research, but we also always stress that there can be no applied research without curiosity-driven research, because applied research uses knowledge to be applied to a society. And we also stress always that also for fields like the humanities, the geesteswetenschappen, the humanities, they even have also a lot of collaborations where you find, let's say, fundamental knowledge being applied yet again to other examples in society. And we often use examples, I wrote whole books on that, for example, formal linguistic theory, so really linguistics, as a linguistic theory that has been applied to create the fourth generation of programming languages. So you create programming languages and you can program them as if you're talking in English, basically. That was the idea. And there are many of other, this is just one slide example, but there are many other examples. Also examples from philosophy where people like Hannah Arendt, for example, has really changed our vocabulary by things like the banality of evil. Now, this does not ring a bell. This last example may not be a good example to convince the current government. I realize that. But I don't find it problematic to show that curiosity-driven research, for example, the example of doing formal research in theoretical linguistics, has been applied by groups of linguists and computer scientists to create to do applied research. And I think for pragmatic reasons, we can do that. Another thing that we do, so to give the full answer, is that we continue to stress, we also did that at our last alternative opening, that a well-educated society is important for our well-being and for the economy. And this is a result that has been replicated many times by economists, by sociologists, and not only in the Netherlands, but also in the US. So here you have another example where, let's say a good and well-educated society indeed is also important for a country. And the fact that we're now so much, cutting on this budget for research and education has this immense risk to become also a problem for the Dutch economy. Now, I fully agree that this is immensely pragmatically thought, but it's the way we have to convince our politicians. But there can be a link, as I said, between fundamental curiosity-driven research and applied research. Now, the critical research is a more problematic case, perhaps, but also there are important examples how university, take as an example Leiden University, also in the time of occupation, the Nazi German occupation, was a shining light, thanks to their critical stance towards justice, towards, let's say, discrimination, towards anti-Semitism and these kind of things. So here you also have, I think, a quite uncontroversial example where critical research could also be defended. But again, this is not a good example in the current situation. So here in the current situation, we only use the examples that we know, ring a bell in the public.
Yeah. I guess the fundamental biochemistry work that led to the COVID vaccinations is another example that's sort of on people's mind. Yeah.
And that was also curiosity-driven initially, right? It had nothing to do with creating a vaccine for COVID, because COVID-19 was not yet there.
Yeah.
Anne, can I ask a question?
Yeah, Geert-Jan, and then I'll read a question from the chat.
Okay. Rens, thanks very much for a nice presentation. We also read your book, and I find it very interesting. And you emphasize academic freedom a lot, and I think that was very important also. And when you take a stance against the government, you need to defend critical research, you need to defend fundamental research. But how about academic freedom for collaborations? Because, within Scientist Rebellion, obviously a question is, should scientists at the university be allowed to collaborate with fossil fuel companies who are not Paris-aligned? And similarly, should scientists be allowed to collaborate with Israeli universities in view of what's happening with Palestine? What do you think about that? And
extremely. That's a very, very important question indeed. We could talk for a long time about it, of course. So academic freedom is not just a notion of freedom without limits. It also comes with responsibilities. We say at certain parts in our book. So responsibility can be a moral responsibility. Why not? Why should we collaborate with the military to create the next best atomic and nuclear bomb? So this seems uncontroversial. But there is a whole layered, or let's say hierarchical structure almost of things that are, absolutely rejectable, and things that are, somewhat closer to, to some people are maybe in favor of it, some people are against it. So it's clear that there's no absolute rule. I mean, whether you like it or not, we can't say beforehand it's absolutely morally wrong to collaborate with this and that company. But taking the case of Shell, for example, there you can actually show, and this has been shown several times again, despite the very sad, I must admit, jurisdiction this morning, but it has very often been shown that Shell has not done anything. So this is a company that has not done anything to help if I'm right, I'm not here the chemist, but if I'm right, Shell has not done anything really to reduce, to help reducing the acceleration of global warming. Let's put it like that. And then you can have serious doubts whether collaborating with a company like that, but there are many other examples, is morally right or wrong. So academic freedom is wonderful, but it always comes with a responsibility. And this is not only our academic responsibility, but also our general moral responsibility.
Okay, thanks.
There's a question in the chat, which I will read out. A rhetoric I hear a lot is that there are too many HBO or university students, and we need more people with a practical profession. With the example given here is installing solar panels, etc. And maybe think of other very concrete, people that we need. Should universities be a priority now? And maybe a side question that I'm adding myself is, what should be the ideal size of a university even? Which fraction of people should ideally go to university in a given society?
Well, that the last one is of course an empirical question. Well, it's an empirical question to a certain extent. It has been shown that a higher educated population leads also to a let's say a higher well-being of the country. But how far? There must be a saturation, of course. Otherwise, we don't have any plumbers anymore, right? And so how far up to what
solar
percentage
panel installation people?
Yeah, right, or whatever.
Yeah.
So we need people that also do these things. The MBO people are but don't forget that also MBO students are now considered to be students. So I know that I'm here defending right now higher education. But there is this discussion that the whole notion of higher, middle, or low is quite controversial nowadays. Right? There is this continuity, and also if you see what people at MBOs are doing, I've been following it a little bit because a colleague of mine is studying MBOs as a kind of let's say institution. There is a lot of questioning that it comes very close, and it comes closer and closer to the notion of research. They call it even research, but of course it's not comparable to university research. But still, there is this fascinating coherence and continuity that actually I believe should be much more emphasized. People are interesting. Just think about citizen science. Just think about how popular that actually is. How much people like to contribute to many of these things. But okay, I agree that we need also a lot of people from an MBO or HBO, let's say a more practical or a vocational kind of background. The only thing is that in many fields, also academic fields, there is actually a lack of people. So if you look at high school teachers, there's a lack of high school teachers right now, and most of these people, not all of them, are taught at universities. There is right now a lack of engineers in the Netherlands. We need to get them from abroad. So there also, but actually there's also a lack of teachers in, you wouldn't expect that perhaps, in classical languages like Latin and Greek. The gymnasiums, for maybe the wrong reasons, but the gymnasiums in the Netherlands are extremely popular, but there is a lack of teachers there. So we can say, well, what is the percentage of people that we need? But it's clear that every time politicians, also recently in Denmark, have tried to figure out, these are the fields that are important for society. They were wrong. They turned out to be wrong. Just a few decades ago, people thought that sinology, the study of Chinese languages and culture, was entirely a luxury activity. And now we need, or not only now, since the last 25 years, sinologists, so people specialized in Chinese languages, are very much sought after because very much in terms of we need at least 20 students every year to graduate in that field. That's actually the amount of people. But this can change immediately in 10 years' time again. So it's terribly difficult to decide what will be the important fields. Sure. We know at least for a number of things like the high school teachers, the amount of what's the term, medics, call them doctors. You need a kind of percentage of students to do that. But who could ever have thought? So I come, although I'm a professor in computational humanities, I come from the field of artificial intelligence, which I was a professor of in St. Andrews, at the University of St. Andrews, and where. When I was teaching there, people, at least the administrative people, did not know anything about AI. And when I told that I was a professor in the field, they said, is that like that film AI? Because there was a famous film in artificial intelligence. So it showed also, and at that time, AI had very few applications in the real world. It was really a field that was very esoteric. very deterministic, and with very few actual real-world applications. And that also has now completely turned around. So my claim is, it is really too hard to decide on this, but I also understand that somehow you need a kind of balance, that you say this is the percentage, but we need all these people together. Yeah. Yeah.
I will read another question. So great, keep them coming. I was a student at the start of the WO and Actie movement in 2017 and felt alienated by the strikes and occupations, as I didn't fully understand how budget cuts would impact my education. And how can the movement better engage all students, especially first generation ones, to build and maintain their support?
Wow. Oh, yeah, that sounds like a really meiotic question. So how so I kind of like
So maybe the core is sort of how the budget cuts would impact education for perhaps students that have just started, is a bit what I'm reading here, perhaps a first or second year student.
The person who asked it felt really alienated also by alienated by the activists, the actions of WO and Actie, right?
This is, yeah, I mean, if you want to be on video and discuss, then feel free, but otherwise this is sort of the question that they wrote in the chat.
No, I find this a very interesting point indeed. How can we involve them more and better? Well, I think when we were striving 7 years ago for proper funding, it was a situation where people could still basically keep all the different fields and disciplines in the air by just doing a lot of overwork, so to say. So they gave the courses, but now, today, what will happen actually already from the 1st of September next year, there will be entire disciplines disappearing. So African studies, which is perhaps, you could say, a niche thing, but Africa may be the next upcoming continent. This seems to be the case, by the way. Whole African studies and culture will be gone in Leiden from the 1st of September onwards. So basically, there will be some courses put together, I think, with international studies in The Hague, but all the specialism will go away. And this may bring quite a change for students, high school students, or perhaps even current students that want to study African studies. And this is just then gone. And then you see that there will be a real tough thing happening. Not just African studies will disappear, Middle Eastern studies will disappear in Leiden. They will be joined perhaps together with Asian studies. But things will really... so they started only with the Faculty of Humanities, but I've also heard that the University of Twente, which is a technical university, is running into serious problems right now. Here at the University of Amsterdam, the Faculty of Science, Natuurwetenschappen, Wiskunde en Informatica, is really running into problems. So lots of courses will disappear. So this may be then important for students to realize that that's perhaps a thing they can really see, whereas they perhaps did not see 7 years ago how much overwork their professors were actually doing. Maybe they saw it, maybe they saw it a little bit, but they didn't feel the consequences of it. But now they will actually feel them.
Hey, and Rens, the protest also against the langstudeerboete, right? It's the protest.
So, one other thing that's also good. Thank you very much, Jan, for that. I think 7 years ago we were fighting against this underfunding, so the underfinancing of the universities. We were joining forces together with the students that were fighting. Also at that time against, let's say, the reduction of their basisbeurs. But now there will be this additional budget cut, that is the langstudeerboete, so that they get a fine for if they study more than 1 year extra. And this is also something where we strongly can join forces. I agree that 7 years ago this was much less much less clear, much less transparent. Have I convinced the person who has asked the question?
Yeah, sorry, maybe I can explain a little bit more. You didn't need to convince me. Like I am already convinced, but when I was studying 7 years ago, I didn't know like how universities worked. Like I just started studying as a first generation student, so they were blocking my university building and I couldn't go to my classes, and I didn't understand why I was missing out on my courses. And I remember the students that were protesting were being quite frustrated that I didn't understand why, like, their conviction. And I see the same happening like at my current university in Wageningen where I teach, for instance, with like the education buildings were occupied by Extinction Rebellion students for a few times last academic year while I was teaching, and I just saw kind of the same sentiment with my own students. And I really want to try to prevent this, kind of like rift between students that support the movement and students that maybe don't understand, and especially if also like their teachers join in. And I think that the langstudeerboete is a very good thing that, well, it's not a good thing, but it's something that can help to convince them. But what I'm mostly worried about is that we should make the language that we use as accessible as possible, to not kind of get lost in these like institutional hierarchies and complications, but really make the message as clear as possible for students that don't really understand how research is funded, because it's really a far from their bed show. So I was wondering, like, if you have an idea of like what are good examples to use. I think especially in Wageningen, like we haven't heard anything yet about what our cuts are going to look like, just that we have to make an 80 million cut, and what it's going to be, we'll find out later, which is a different thing in itself. So we cannot really use these examples yet that unfortunately Leiden and other universities already have. But thank you. And also thank you for the link to the Google Drive, because I'll definitely look into that.
Yeah, no, nice question. I wouldn't know how to do it right now, because also at the University of Amsterdam, they have not decided anything about how these budget cuts will be implemented. They claim even that it's not necessary for the coming year to do any. So the university has been lucky here, but other universities have been less lucky. It might even be the case that as long as universities have not decided, and this will become clearer next year if this government does not fall, as long as the universities do not decide how the immense cuts will be implemented, most of our lecturers, most of our staff, but also most of the students are not that particularly active in activism, you could say, right? I think they might be less interested to become active. Yet we are building. So your question, we're building up this activism, of course. But your question, what could be the good examples? Well, lots of but are students sensitive to that? That electives will disappear? That there will be less. Well, certainly, if they have to finish, perhaps that the next decision will be that they have to finish their whole course, their whole bachelor in less than 3 years, rather than the possibility to do it in 4 years. That might also become quite a shock for many students. That they will be really shocked. So I think that we should stay indeed very close to their direct context. Yes. Well, thanks, Claudia.
Anne gave me the word already through the chat. Thank you. Hi, Rens. Yeah, I mean, of course, we are all focused on finances at the moment for very good reasons, but I was happy that you obviously included the whole issue of democratization and how indeed extremely difficult it is. And I guess my general question is, how do we get the juice in there again? How do we get like some dynamic in there again? How do we do this? And especially because I mean, I for example, I have a good friend in Florida, and what we've seen happening in Hungary is also happening there, only nobody notices at the moment, and she's at the front line. And you can see how a hierarchically organized university is extremely vulnerable when the government turns right-wing or extreme right. So you just have to have, you just have to put the right person at the top, and then everything works from there. And then if people resist, right, if a dean resists against sort of post-tenure reviews of people who are not politically streamlined enough, then they would just put in another person. And the same with the department chair. So for me, it was kind of shocking to hear how smoothly that actually works. And I just wonder how do we get the message out? And also strategically, I mean, what would be the best thing to demand? I also think that probably election of rectors would be good, but I think that's quite urgent to prepare for the moment when there's an opening or when something happens, that you kind of push that topic forward.
Yeah, very, very important question. This, if I knew the answer, I would be extremely happy. What would be the strategically the best way to go? Yeah, that's also a matter of time and energy, of course. If we had all enough time to continue pressing always this message by showing how important democracy is, how much also the problems in the Dutch universities regarding social safety are connected to a lack of democracy. It has been so clear now. Just most recent case in Delft, at the University of Delft. Sorry, people from Delft, but. That's a matter of fact. I mean, we've written several even newspaper articles on that, but there it stopped simply for lack of time. But indeed, it would so much help if there would be kind of weekly demonstration pressing every week on this same topic, every Friday afternoon in a completely pacifistic and peaceful way. Pressing it every week again. Maybe we should perhaps put up. Oh no, that's even forbidden nowadays. So I thought let's put out a tent camp in front of there, but then they sent the police to us. But at least a kind of peaceful demonstration, pressing for this thing until the moment is there, because the next government will be there perhaps in a year. Maybe it will be later, but there will be a moment where people then finally understand. Yes, then there is a need for democracy. You see how much this is felt. But don't forget, I also see lots of colleagues that do not want more democracy. And this is also this is important, a lack of knowledge, because it's important to show to them, to our direct colleagues, that democracy and social safety are actually connected. Yeah, so we have to work on that. Yeah.
Thanks.
Can I maybe follow up on this? I was recently reading a very nice post on the importance of also small wins for building movements. Perhaps some other people have seen this from the Social Change Lab in the UK. So they sort of analyze, what predicts actually a sustained and successful social movement. And a lot of people are here from Scientists for Rebellion, Scientists for Future. So some of these, demands that you could make are quite far away and quite large. So I'm curious if you're also thinking about a sort of, stepwise set of smaller demands. I mean, stopping the budget cut seems like a very immediate one now in time, but also then to build in sort of wins that make people feel empowered to continue.
This is actually right now happening, or that has actually happened. The example, although it's a very small step, because that's actually what you refer to, right? Small steps that bring out in the end a big change. This has happened just right now during the last 4 or 5 years with this jus promovendi, with this right to for everybody to have their own PhD students and to doctorate them. At the University of Eindhoven, I think they've opened it up to all academic staff now, right, including lecturers. So it's from assistant professors to associate and full professors. At most universities, they have at least opened it up to, that's very limited, but to some of the associate and sometimes all associate professors. And this already changes the hierarchy a lot, because if you're an assistant professor at the University of Eindhoven, this has now changed, but if you were an assistant professor and you are always dependent on another full professor, this creates a very unhealthy work situation, really very unhealthy. And this is a small step, and this has been done also together with the Jonge Academie, who wrote, maybe you remember this, who wrote a lot of articles on getting rid of this terribly hierarchical situation. And I'm sure that this will not stop. This will continue. This let's say destruction of the extreme hierarchy. I mean, some hierarchy must perhaps be there. I mean, we have to grade our students, so there is a hierarchical relationship between lecturer and student, of course. But also there we can work on a better situation, I believe. But I believe that the demolishment of hierarchy in universities is a thing that cannot be stopped. It's a small step, but the next step would be really more democracy at universities. And this is something that all bestuurders, all managers seem to be, it's really so frustrating, but I haven't been able to talk to one bestuurder, one manager at the Dutch universities who's in favor of choosing their own rectors, which I fully, I completely don't understand it. This is the current situation also at the universities in Flanders, for example. They are just the closest ones. So Leuven chooses their own rector and dean, so why not here?
Can I push a bit on this? Do you know if there's also a higher turnout for university elections?
Yeah, there's a higher
Definitely one thing
turnout
that I've seen in Leiden is I think it's like maybe just around 20% or so, right?
Yeah,
so
it's
then
very
it would actually not be a very strong democratic mandate if you were to elect someone and very few people vote.
Okay. Indeed, the percentage of people that vote is much higher there, but I should also modestly actually admit that choosing your own rector does not necessarily mean there's not one-to-one relationship, that this also reduces, let's say, social unsafety. There's much more to be worked on. Democracy involves more than just going to vote once every 4 years. There should be a direct participation in lots of decisions. So there's much more to be done there. But we strongly believe that this is a first step. It cannot be done by simply, the powers that be. For example, at the University of Amsterdam, it's even the case that our own dean is not even an employee of its own faculty, so of their own faculty. So they're directly employed by the CVB, but I've heard that this was one thing that a former dean told me, that at once he was out of the system because he was now employed at the highest top. He was not anymore a member of their own faculty. Now, this is completely out of my mind, I would say. But it's true that if people are more involved, if they feel that they have more power, they can decide who will be the next dean. There's also a higher turnout in the elections. That's at least what you see in Flanders, but I don't know the numbers. Well, I know because my partner is working in France. There, people are very, very engaged, as you may know, in choosing and electing their own presidents, their own, as they call them, the président, their own deans, etc. Because it's also a power game. I realize that there will also, so it's not such an easy thing to do, but democracy is an important part of, we believe, of this notion of universitas. Yeah. I don't hear you, sorry.
Are there any more questions? We're almost at the hour, so I want to make sure that we don't miss anyone's questions, but can also start to wrap up.
Also, thank you, by the way, everybody, for your patience, because I realized that a couple of things went wrong at the beginning. Sorry.
So maybe what I would propose is to thank Rens again, and we can maybe stop the recording. If anyone wants to still chat for another few minutes next to the webinar,